just to say we've been having some technical difficulties, so Instagram isn't on at the moment, so I might have to say hello to people again in a minute. Apologies for that. The keyboard stopped working, the mixing desk stopped working, Instagram stopped working. It's like a message from the universe, but I'm ignoring it, and that's the key. Hope you're okay. I just got back after a week in Cornwall where there are massive storms. We lost electricity and internet connection, and if that wasn't challenging enough, one of the other things that happened was we decided to do laser tag in the open air the day after the storm. And let me tell you, 11-year-old girls are incredibly violent and hostile. That's all I'm going to say. The boys were nowhere near as aggressive. Just putting it out there. I've also got an injury on my head. One of the laser tag guns ended up in my head and my nose. And you're right, laser tag is meant to be conducted from a distance. They didn't get the memo. And I've got a big lump on my head because of that. Just thought I'd share my problems with you before we start. How are we all? Hope we're all feeling all right. Nice to see you. If you've not been here before, you can ask questions throughout this. Usually Facebook is the best place to ask the question, just because it's instant and we see it, but I believe YouTube isn't too difficult as well. So hello, I will move on in a second. Nice to see people. I can only see the people on Facebook. So hello to you guys. Nice to see you. And girls, obviously, just using a generic guys there as opposed to guys and girls and everything in between. Right, one of the things I was asked was about voices. Hello Instagram, sorry I'm chatting away because we're on all the other platforms, but you have taken longer to connect with. So I've just been doing my little introduction. Hi to people who haven't been here before, and you also missed out on the violent assault I received during laser tag whilst running through a field and just discussing the fact that 11-year-old girls can be quite aggressive. Just saying. Right, let's get on with it. One of the things that I was asked just briefly in an email that I'm going to cover quickly at the beginning of this, because I know you're watching, is about voices in your head. And it was quite a vague question, so it's quite a big subject area. I'm going to talk about it anyway, to just kind of put it in the context of covering all bases. So when people think about people hearing voices, what we know as auditory hallucinations is something that they're called. Often people will instantly jump to things like psychosis or schizophrenia or a major mental illness. And I understand that because pretty much the movies and TV will always have an individual who's suffering from those kind of auditory hallucinations as having some kind of critical issue with their mental health, usually needing some kind of medication. And I appreciate that TV always talks bollocks really about these things and usually does extreme things just because it gets people to watch. But the truth is about 1 in 10 people have what we know as auditory hallucinations. So it's quite common. You think about that as 10% of the population. And the majority of those won't have a mental illness. And people who have personality disorders can experience it, people who are highly stressed and anxious, people who are suffering from PTSD. So yes, it's classified as a mental health issue, but it's something that can be overcome. So we're not talking about a brain disorder like bipolar or brain disease like schizophrenia. You know, these are things that are common when we're in anxious and stressful situations. And when you're experiencing them, it's important to know, firstly, what's going on. Because if you're having an auditory hallucination or a voice that you can hear that other people can't hear, then it depends what the context is. If it's a voice that you hear that isn't actually upsetting you or traumatizing you or telling you terrible things about yourself or deriding you in some way that makes you feel terrible, then arguably that isn't going to be an issue for you to some degree. And I don't think we talk about that very often because people instantly assume that a voice in your head is going to be something that's really bad and symbolic of something failing within your psyche. And it isn't the case. So you have to firstly acknowledge, what is the voice? What is it saying to me? Is it one voice? Are there many voices? Does it feel like it's my voice that is becoming a separated sense of who I am speaking to the self, so to speak? Or does it feel like totally separate entities? What is the content and the context of the voice? Is it upsetting me? Is it making me think about doing awful things to myself or other people? Because it's separate to something like an intrusive thought, which obviously is awful on the OCD spectrum, and that is very difficult to deal with. So first of all, challenge what is the voice. If it's okay, then you probably don't need to think about it beyond that. If it is making you feel terrible about yourself, but you actually think it could be to do with high stress and anxiety, and that it's more about you talking to yourself in a way that's negative because of the situations that are going on around you, then it's definitely worth speaking to your primary caregiver, like a GP, because it's important to acknowledge that you might be struggling with stress and anxiety. If it is, of course, the more extreme, such as you are hearing voices and they're terrifying you and they're telling you to do terrible things, or they're telling you terrible things are going to happen to you, absolutely, I would say that's a critical issue that you need dealing with. But it doesn't mean that you are falling apart or that your mental health is unsalvageable. Quite the contrary. It just means that you need to reduce your stress levels and potentially, just potentially, have some medication. But genuinely, many people hear voices. We should talk about that more often. And hearing voices is different than having them in your head, just to put it out there. So if you're like me, I have at least like 60 voices in my head that all talk to me in different accents, and they're all me, just like having conversations with myself. I don't physically hear it like Pete is sat next to me saying, "Hey Emma, you look great in that pink top of mine. Why do you keep wearing my expensive D-squared top?" He might say that if he was next to me right now. That would be how I heard it. So that's a proper auditory hallucination where you actually physically are hearing it, not the ones that you hear in your head that you're creating and manifesting. That's the separation. I hope I've answered that. If it's confusing, it's because it is quite confusing because it's massive and wide and broad. But the most important thing is don't stereotype, because everyone bloody stereotypes mental illness these days, don't they? It's like glamorized in certain areas on TV or social media, and it's put into these contexts and concepts that I think makes it very difficult for people who are genuinely struggling with certain things to either ask questions or to notably understand whether it really is an issue or otherwise. Particularly TikTok right now is doing my head in around that stuff. Ridiculous the way that there are whole groups of people almost creating these groups where true issues that are actually really debilitating and limiting and upsetting are being portrayed for views and aren't actually, in my opinion, genuine. It's driving me a little bit kooky. Hi Emma, my 8-year-old is worrying over everything. He seems to catastrophize whatever is happening. If he hears a noise, he thinks someone is trying to get in the house or that I'm hurt. If he hears a bang, he thinks someone has a gun. He's panicking, there'll be another war, etc. The wind will turn into a tornado. Everything is a huge worry and extreme. I try to speak it through with him, but he doesn't seem to be helping. Any ideas? Thanks. So first of all, at 8 years of age, and this can happen anywhere, I'd say between 6 and 9. Sometimes it can be younger with respect, rarely older, but this is completely contextual. This is the point in life where it gets real for a kid. And it's heartbreaking. And if your child is born with a temperament that is more sensitive, and we're all born with this temperament, we can manipulate that temperament, we really can. I often talk about it. You look at me now and I'm confidently talking and I appear a certain way, but it's taken many, many years of development. I call it my confidence cloak. I just put it on. But when I was a child, I was horrifically sensitive. I have still a lot of tics. My tics can get really bad. Definitely when I'm more anxious. When I was a child, I had no control of the tics at all. The reason I move my hands a lot is because otherwise I'll tic quite a lot. So essentially, as a kid, I was like super, super sensitive. I used to put my skirt over my head when I saw people approaching, which was a terrible coping strategy for anybody. I mean, somebody should have just been like, you might be sensitive, but that is a terrible, terrible strategy. You know, it's embarrassing for all of us. But the point is that if you look at me now and then look at me then, you wouldn't believe that I was that kid. But I was that kid. And the world was overwhelming for me. So I physicalized all of my anxiety into like tics and all these different physical experiences. And that was how I manifested coping. Your child is at 8 years of age. It's probably got a temperament similar to mine. Probably bright. So he's interpreting the world at a level where he's a little bit too intelligent to be able to actually manage the emotions that that creates. He's thinking about war. He's thinking about the potential personal mortality of himself and you. They're big existential questions that adults struggle to deal with. Imagine Having those questions at 8 years of age. I mean, most children don't think of them. And that's the big thing. Most kids aren't having those bigger questions. Now, most kids at that age realise mum and dad are going to die. And there'll be mums and dads on here right now who have had that situation. I can remember my own son breaking his heart. My first son more than my second, because obviously the firsts are everything, aren't they? You get your first child, you treat them like glass, you remember everything. Your second, you're just in a haze of just living and not being too exhausted to cook tea, ideally. So the first child, you kind of remember that. I'm sure it happened with my second child, and he does have infinite meaning to me, but I've forgotten whether that occurred. But my first, they broke down. He was absolutely devastated. Devastated. I'm not permanent. Your kid's there, and he's asking bigger questions. War, the potential natural disasters. So you've got a little boy with questions that big boys and girls, grown-ups ask, and it's too big for him. So what can you do? Well, first of all, there's going to be a level of anxiety there. So anything that can reduce that anxiety is really important. So think about any kind of meditation streams, any kind of distraction techniques. It might be that you look at getting an anxiety app where it's specifically for children, but it has like games and distraction abilities that means it takes them away from that situation just for a small period of time. Meditation's really good, helping them to just deep breathe through scenarios. But then it's the bigger things that you can help them with, which is to answer some of those existential questions by making it more manageable. And of course, you're not in control of whether we go to war. Rich men tend to be in control of that, who have a vested interest in certain things. The common person doesn't want war, ever. It's a terrible idea, dreadful idea. And you can do a lot of that work with your child, which is, I'm really proud of you for being concerned about these bigger pictures. That says something profound about your nature. It says something really special about who you are as a little boy. And these questions are too big for your little boy head to manage, and that's okay. Because even though they're there, well, we're going to figure out how we can manage them better. So you bring it back to that point of reassurance that these questions he's asking are actually good questions. Secondly, that he shouldn't be expected to know the answers to the world's ills. None of us do. But to reflect that the fact that he's even in a space where he's exploring that is profound and says something really special about him. So that reinforces the fact that, okay, you can't manage this, but hey, the fact that you're giving it a shot, that says something amazing about you. So let's look at it on a micro level. What can we do in our environment to make sure that we get the best out of everything that we have in this space right now? And you can arguably bring that down to, he's realised that you and he have infinite meaning. Your lives have got infinite value. And anything that threatens that is scaring him, because really you are the most important person in his world. So you bring it down to that, which is okay. We can't control the bigger picture, but what we can do is we control the smaller picture, is how do we keep ourselves fit and healthy? How do we really protect our environment in a way that makes us feel safe, such as feeling really blessed that we've got a door that we can lock at night, feeling really grateful that when the wind blows, our windows don't blow out because of the world that we live in the UK, feeling really positive about the relationships that have such meaning in our world that when we think about losing them, that scares us, and saying, well, okay, how do we practice being really grateful every single day for all of those experiences, so that when we are in a space of reminding ourselves of how grateful we are, we can also connect with the people who similarly reflect that value, i.e. you and him. Get him to do a gratitude jar every single night. Get him to think of 3 things that he's felt really grateful for in the day, and 1 thing that he struggled with, but he's made it through, and just constantly reinforce that. And be that safe space where you're like, hey, the world is scary sometimes, and it feels overwhelming sometimes, but usually that's because you're a really good human being who's trying to figure stuff out. And as you walk through the years that will come, you'll pick up more of the resources and capacities that will help you to manage that better. Just do that reassurance work. Like I said, reduce the anxiety by helping him to create micro control over an environment that he has power over, and then help to create exercises around how you reduce that anxiety. And also, don't ever ignore the elephant in the room, because the biggest thing will be he's scared of you dying, and he should be. It's scary and it's okay, but you can do a lot to reassure him that actually you're going to be around for a long time and that you're going to work really hard to keep being around. And thanatophobia, which is the fear of death, it's increased massively. And you have to also note that we've had kids, in your case, a son who's lost 2 years of normality developmentally. He's had so many challenges because of masks and restrictions and lockdowns. He's had so many images and messages of death, 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 death. You're going to kill your granny. It's been unforgivable as far as I'm concerned what we've done to children. But let's not pretend that it would be anything but weird if our kids didn't react, if our kids didn't feel that the world had become vulnerable and unsafe. And we're just getting over one issue and then the next one's here. It's like, oh, right, okay, COVID's kind of like, got to a point where we're managing, so let's just do war now. Then global warming again. It's like this disaster narrative is terrible for humans because it's making us exist as opposed to live. What we have to do with our children and what will really help with our children's development is to teach them that, life is risky. Ultimately, it's terminal at the end of the day. And we might not want to talk about that because it makes us feel uncomfortable. It shouldn't. It's an everyday thing. Life is terminal. It's just the dash between birth and death. And however long you get in between that, it's up to you and it's on you to live fully. This breath of consciousness, this blink of an eye, you got blessed with it. And instead of us being afraid of living and experiencing this momentary wonder that we managed to win, and we did manage to win. You were literally the sperm and the egg. Out of all the billions and billions of sperm that men will definitely have used before impregnating you, and so on and so forth, we won it. And if we're going to throw away that lottery of life through fear, well, what a shame and what a disservice to this moment. And I think with children, we need to be having those conversations with them. Help them reframe it, help them to understand that life is full of risk, and that's okay. Because when we accept that gracefully and gratefully and also respectfully, and we carry on living our lives fully, embracing every opportunity, saying yes to as many things as possible, that's when we get the best out of everything. So our kids have been stifled, and now we have to help them build resilience and prevent that suffocation that emotionally they've been enduring for a long period of time, in my opinion. Other opinions are welcome. Hi, Emma. I have graduated my LLB and want to become a coroner. I have done work experience but feel it was very difficult on my mental health. Do I carry on or leave? You know what? That's a big question, right? It's a big question. Because on one level, wow, incredible that you've done what you've done. And obviously legal issues is something that you've learned a great deal about. You've succeeded in the LLB. This is an amazing thing to have done. That will have been incredibly hard work. And you've obviously gone and had experience working in areas that many of us would not choose to work in because of the fact that obviously when you're a coroner, you're dealing with people's deaths. My situation with my dad's suicide was having to go to a coroner's inquest, and it was relatively challenging to sit through one of those. And also, I have to be honest with you, the person who did my dad's inquest, I would rather stand in a lift with a shark than ever share a coffee with that person. So there's a few things that I'd say to you. As a good human being who's empathic and compassionate, who cares deeply about other human beings and what's happened, you're always going to get hurt by certain information. Because when you think about a coroner's situation, a coroner's court, their job basically is to diligently look at evidence to decide how a death played out, whether that's an accidental death, a sudden death, a death in hospital that's unexpected, and so on and so forth. So if you have those capacities, on one level, it makes you much better than somebody who's simply legally judicious and able to look at the facts in a very neutral way. I don't think there is a neutrality where people's lives are concerned. I think we have to be deeply invested in what is right and what is just, and being able to fight for that. But I also know that my brother trained initially as a barrister. We're working class people, so he literally qualified, went to chambers, and then said this isn't for me because he didn't feel that he fitted in and connected. And the other thing that he said was he never wanted to spend his life fighting. And I'd never thought of it like that. He said for his mental health, the idea of fighting constantly just didn't fit who he was. And absolutely, even though he's a fantastic human being with an incredible eloquence when it comes down to his own point of view, I've been around and worked with barristers, and I appreciate that it is quite difficult when people have a winning idea about how life has to play out. So I also get that if that's your nature, the idea of being there and having to dole out justice and inquire about situations that people might be wanting to hide information about, and actually also probably having a lot of pressure on you from particular sources to not necessarily look in certain directions, because there is always corruption everywhere that we go. I think they're really difficult. So I guess the bigger thing comes down to this: what is it about being a coroner that really speaks to you? If being a coroner speaks to you because you absolutely want to be the difference, you diligently want to explore every avenue, and you don't care about whether the NHS are annoyed with you when you tell them that they made a terrible job, or you don't want to agree with the police when they say that this was just, a suicide, and you feel that there's pressure on you to just say and do those things because it fits in with what's expected in that moment, then you probably are an amazing candidate because you're going to do the right thing. However, having said all of those things, and we definitely need more empathic, caring individuals who are coroners, who seek justice and go out of their way to make sure that they preside in a dutiful way that makes a difference to the community and society, and certainly for those individuals who've lost their lives. If you can do that, that'd be amazing. But equally, if you're thinking, God, this is nothing like I wanted to do. And I've worked with a lot of people who've thought that they really wanted to do things like be a therapist because, it feels like a great idea, sitting down and helping people navigate their issues. But you've got to have a certain mindset. And it's not that they're failing when they don't actually enjoy it or it bores them. Some people get really bored. They don't want to sit in a room with somebody and listen to their problems in the end. So the idea of what you want to do versus the reality of it can be very different. And the most important thing in life is firstly to know that you should always work hard at what you want to do. Sure, you could. Absolutely. I'm not one of these people who believes, this isn't going how I imagined, I should just give it up. I think work through it. And if you still don't like it, it's the right thing to do to leave, right? So I'm always the person who says push harder. Don't give up initially. But if you're thinking, I don't like this, I really don't enjoy it, and I can genuinely say I wouldn't have enjoyed it, definitely wouldn't have enjoyed that job. Coroner to me would be pretty exhausting and at times quite depressing, I think, and also quite frustrating. And some people are just made for that work. You've got a legal mind, you may be, but there's just no shame at all in going, glad I tried it, totally different mindset, won't fit me, I'm moving on. Mental health doesn't want to deal with it because I don't like it. No shame at all. So sorry to go around in a big circle, but because of my personal experience with coroner's courts, I also thought I'd bring that in because I do think it must be very challenging, and there's nothing wrong with saying, I want to do something different, ever. Even if it's not even to do with the law. It's because you did your LLB doesn't mean you have to do that. You might have a completely different purpose. There might be something in you that's driving you more to seek out being compassionate and empathic, and there's something that maybe that's family law, maybe there's something about working with people who are dealing with difficult situations and need people to be really on their side and have that compassion. It's good that you're compassionate and empathic and think about mental health though, because it says to me you're the right kind of the person to be working with people. How is it possible for someone to have passed extremely close to you and they have, but it still feels like they may come back even though it isn't possible? I'm so mixed up. I don't know if it's because I don't want to accept it, so I fall apart, or it's something else. I know she's gone, but part of me is just holding on to something. Sorry for the long-winded question. That's not a long-winded question. You've just described the most normal experience in grief. And it's not just from my own personal experience, it's from everybody I've ever worked with during grief. It's exactly what they say. So why do you expect that they'll come back? Because you are too overwhelmed to expect and accept that this person who meant the world to you is not still here. We go in life from having these human beings, even animals, things of great meaning. And we spend our years with them and we invest in them, and they are infinite in our world because of the fact that their presence has always been. And then in a moment, in literally a breath, they're gone. And then their body's completely gone. And then we have to adjust to a lifetime without them. An entire lifetime. And our brain cannot comprehend that in a moment. It's too overwhelming, it's too catastrophic in that moment to even begin to envisage a life without them. So our brain goes into some people say it's numbness, shock, disbelief, denial. Denial, I suppose, is the one that we're talking about, but I don't think it's denial. I just think it's a life of habit of everything feeling a certain way and then suddenly it's gone. And we have to adjust to that. And our brain just isn't going to make us manifest that instantly. It's going to be like, we need to do this really gently. Because believe me, that's the one thing I don't understand about grief. It is so catastrophic when you lose somebody of great meaning to you. It's so overwhelming. It's so utterly life-changing that if you were to comprehend it all in that moment, I think you would just dissolve. Genuinely would just fall apart and have breakdowns instantly. And some of us do anyway. But the reason that your brain is cheating you, it's because it's soothing you to some degree. It's saying, yeah, I'll be fine. We'll see her again. And even though you're going, no, she's dead. It's like, yeah, she's dead, but we'll see her again. It's the way that your brain slowly helps you to adjust to the fact that she isn't coming back in this lifetime. So it's completely normal. And you're going to go through different stages. Some people say there's 4 stages of grief. Some people say there's 5 stages. Some people say there's 7 stages of grief. I'm sure that someone will come out with 23 stages of grief at some point. I don't really need somebody to tell me what the stages of grief are, because as far as I'm concerned, it's subjective for everybody. But I would say that the most of us agree that it's deeply overwhelming. We're never prepared for it, even when we think we're prepared for it. Recognizing that person is no longer present is overwhelmingly challenging to even connect with, and habit has been formed. You're used to having them in your world. You can't just break it instantly, and it's going to take time, and it takes a lot of time. Just know that at some point you won't feel that disconnect as much as you do now. In July, it will be 3 years having lost my dad. I now have that sense of I will never, ever get over losing him. Of course not, and don't want to. I will never forget him. He will always be a major part of who I am in my life, day to day. But I laugh now. I have fun now. I know he's dead and he's not coming home. And I feel I'll see him again in the future one day, but not in this lifetime. And it doesn't hurt like it did. It really hurts if I let myself go there, but I'm saying it doesn't hurt like it did. So just trust that you are built to survive it, and you'll figure it out, and you'll be okay. You'll be okay. But you're at a stage that is so common, and there'll be loads of people commenting on that. But yeah, just trust you'll be okay. And that you won't be betraying them when you are feeling okay. That actually you'll be doing the opposite. You'll be celebrating them. Because people who love us, in the end, want us to just have the life that they always wanted for us, which was to be happy and fulfilled. Hi, Emma. Quick question, if I can. not wanting to get political. Have you been watching my YouTube where I say that? Not wanting to be political, but 15 minutes later, just been a bit political. Can't help it either, so you're in the right place. But after today's announcement regarding COVID from the government, I know lots of people who will struggle to return to any kind of old normal. How can I help them and their anxiety? Some people seem to be based on a lack of trust of people. Any advice, please? This is mainly in the older generations. Thank you. That's a really compassionate thing. And you're absolutely right. So, there's part of me that's just like wanting to go out and just be like, get back to normal, start to live, and these are completely rational feelings as well. So anybody having that feeling is completely normal. We've all been feeling very, very stressed for a few years. But yours is a lovely, compassionate reality. Particularly for the older generation, I think that is so important. And again, the younger generation, so children, because a lot of the older generation very much rely on the MSM. So they've spent their whole 2 years watching the BBC and being told that basically they're about to die. They've been sent figures into their care homes or into their homes telling them about how many people have died every single day. I mean, how bonkers is that, guys? Just, let's just take a step back from anybody's political perspective and views. I know that I have people who come to my sessions and some of you are like so fully invested in the measures. I respect that. You have a right to. Some of you who come here are completely angry with them. I respect that. This isn't about us having to be divided in our opinion, because we've all been fed the same stuff, and we can still take a step back from our feelings and say, how bonkers was it that they had a deathometer? I mean, was it a Saturday morning children's show where they have the populometer? Oh, let's have our popometer. Do you know what I mean? We had a deathometer. That's normal. I mean, if ever there was a highly disrespectful tool, it's a deathometer. Just going to pop another number on there, it's just a life. Now, that's been normalised for 2 years. It's offensive, it's disgusting. The future will look back in horror. And people think that it's normal because the MSM put it out there. Well, it's on the BBC. It's got to be normal. It's reprehensible. And unfortunately, that has made death feel very present for everybody, more so when you're in an older generation and you blindly trust the BBC like you could do 50 years ago, kinda, more than today, because they weren't paid by certain people to say a certain narrative. So you've got people who are genuinely indoctrinated in terrible, terrible situations because of this. You've also got the elderly people who may have lost partners and family members because genuinely they went to hospital, caught COVID and died. Or people in care homes who caught COVID and died. These are all realities for those people. So then to suddenly say, well, hey, let's just remove all restrictions when they feel that those restrictions have been keeping them safe because they haven't been reading about Israel and they haven't been reading, nature about the fact that masks are very ineffective, or they haven't realised that sanitising their hands constantly really isn't going to make that much of a difference. They haven't been doing that because they trust. And also they trust their physicians or their health visitors, and rightfully so, a lot of them should. But what I'm saying is they've all had to look a certain way, haven't they? PPE and lots of masks. And so the world has become very clinical, and we've been asked to give our power away as well. So I know more than you know more than I do apparently, so I'm going to give all my power to you. That's the way it's gone. So now saying to people, right, well, actually that doesn't matter anymore, is going to be really problematic for people. And I think firstly, no one should be forced to do anything. And I always say this, when I talk about wanting to get back to living, I don't want restrictions, I don't want masks. I literally would personally run around schools and rip them off the faces of anybody who thinks they're a good idea, because it's wrong, it's terrible, it's not good for our society. But do I think that people should be forced into not doing it? Absolutely not. For some of the elderly people right now, we need to think about how it's going to be for them, and they're going to have graded exposure. And graded exposure is what they'd use in CBT, it's what they'd use in exposure therapy per se, and it's about helping people get used to it and adjust to it. But everybody has to understand that as we respect those who are struggling, so too do we need to be respected for wanting to get back to normal. So it's that 50-50, isn't it? So I guess if you're going to help the elderly population, you're going to have that help to reduce the anxiety. There's a few things you can tell them. Truthfully, the most important one is the more you expose yourself to your fears, the less fearful you will be. Secondly, some reframing. Look, the elderly population lived through wars. My mum was alive in the war. Like, she remembers hiding under tables when they had the bombs going off because they couldn't afford to any way, shape or form have anything in the garden that could take them underground, you know, just working class people. They used to get under the table. She remembers the bombs falling. She remembers, you know, walking over rubble when they bombed Manchester. These are things that a lot of our elderly population remember. Remind them of the fact that we didn't live in a clinical environment for many decades. It's become clinical. Help them to reflect on times in the past where there have been epidemics and they've survived those epidemics, and just help them to kind of navigate that reference point, because I think that's the way that often reflection can be very useful. So that's how I work with everything. I'm also always reflective. Like, it's a minor example. I have to go to the dentist today, and like, I hate the dentist because my mother decided to just have like a major fear of it. She always went, but I hate it because of the fact it's fine when you go, isn't it? But I don't like them. But the reality is, I just say to myself whenever I go, oh, I was fine last time. When I had that feeling, it was fine. I do a lot of reference plotting. So try to do that with them. And again, the big one is to just, let's be respectful of each other. Let's be respectful of the fact that some older people and some people in general in society are going to be really angry with people who aren't abiding by the old rules. There are going to be some people who are nasty with us when we just get on with our lives. And instead of biting back, this is when we have to be the most compassionate, because the vast majority of people who literally get put online and called Karens, which is bizarre, because it's like, how disrespectful to people who are called Karen to be given this kind of group belief about the way that they behave. The reality is that the vast majority of the Karens online are just scared people, or people who are angry because things have changed. And the last thing that you want to do with anger is meet it with anger. It's usually just like calmly respond to it and meet it with compassion, is my advice. It genuinely is. And my husband will acknowledge that literally we had somebody come up to us and start having a go at us because we weren't wearing a mask. And whereas Pete literally wants to kind of like react like a man from a certain kind of era, like the 80s, I'm very much, I don't really need to get into this conversation, and I don't feel that this conversation is going to be a healthy one, and like I could just be respectful and refuse to engage in that way. We can all do that. But yeah, for the older generations, it's just going to be a lot of peace and a lot of kindness. Let's just be kind to each other. Kindness has been long forgotten. You know, it has, long forgotten. How do you cope with a dysfunctional family life? Divorce them. No, that's a joke. Just to say, when I was growing up, there were like all these kids who were divorcing the parents, and I could never figure it out, but it like literally happened in America, and that's why I made that joke. How do you cope with a dysfunctional family life? Well, I'd need more information on the specifics, but what I would say is, firstly, every single family is dysfunctional to some degree, and I'm not trying to minimize what you're saying. I'm just trying to normalize the fact that the average family, even when it's a loving, connected family, is like a little bit screwed up. Just always is. So be aware that if you're looking at everybody else's picture perfect postcard family, you're not seeing reality. And there'll be lots of people commenting on that. It doesn't mean that those families aren't happy, and it doesn't mean that they don't thrive, and it also doesn't mean that you can't be envious of the elements that you feel they have, because they tend to serve you in your own life for the future to give you an idea of the blueprint of the family you want to create. But don't believe that everybody's life is perfect because you see it online, or you spend a meal with a family member, you know, with a friend's family. This is always mythical to some degree. So dysfunction is rife in every family because of the fact there are different personalities, and this idea that because you're related that you like each other just is not true at all. I mean, amen to that, right? This idea that people like each other because they came out of the same womb just doesn't happen at all. So arguably, if you've got a very dysfunctional family, first off, pick your tribe. So section it off. Is there a particular individual that you actually do connect with? Because that's what you ask yourself first of all. Okay, so I've got all this dysfunction. It doesn't work in the typical way that I want it to, but what are the elements that actually are okay? Like, who is it that reflects you most? Who can you connect with most? And that's where you want to expend a lot of your energy, so that the time that you have in your family environment is spent conducive to a more positive experience. If you have dysfunction, which are things like violence or abuse, well, you don't deal with that, right? It's not that you don't have to deal with that on a mental health level. You don't deal with it on a familial level. No one deserves to be in a family with dysfunction where there is abuse and where there is physical violence or any kind of even emotional abuse, because that isn't healthy and it is not going to serve you well. So arguably, I would always say that if that's happening, ideally you would look at extricating yourself from that situation, because you deserve so much better. If it is that there is dysfunction but there is a lot of love, and we can have this, we can have relationships in our immediate life that genuinely are, shall we say, conflictual, maybe at times moody, maybe at times don't meet our needs, but actually it's soaked in love, well, then that's communication styles. And communication styles are things that every single human being can master with the people in their world by using different formulations. So if you have somebody in a family who is a bulldozer, for example, so somebody who just every time you have an opinion just rolls over your opinion until you're like, okay, I don't have that opinion anymore. That's like a bulldozer. And with those individuals, you just have to learn to stand your ground. You know, you let them just shout and be angry about things and try to force your position into submission, but you just don't acknowledge that. You just don't accept it. You're just like, you know what? I still have this opinion. You don't get into shouting matches with them. You just hold firm. Or if you've got a parent who just bleeds you dry, you know, never ever seems to have any way of solving problems, and when you try to solve it for them, they'll be like, that's a terrible idea, and they make you feel like you have no energy, like an emotional vampire. In those situations, you'd be like, okay, so what is your idea? So instead of like having them ask you for solutions and then just deride all the solutions, you make them think of them. There are communication styles that we can use that mean that we can connect that dysfunction in a way that becomes functional through the style of communication that we use. So it depends which one of those. Like I said, maybe write some more so I can look at specifics, because what I've just done there is a round robin of all different types, including the general familial dysfunction that every family in the whole of the UK and the world definitely experiences at times. I don't know if you read messages. I'm reading it now, but I thought I'd give it a go. So 2 weeks ago, my mum's stepdad suddenly passed away, but she can't seem to remember anything from that day. I've noticed her repeating herself quite a lot, and she's overly upset all the time. She's not sleeping, her weight is dropping, and she's complaining of feeling cold all the time. I've asked her to see a doctor, but she says no. Any advice? Thanks in advance. So the feeling cold, she's not sleeping, she's not eating, her weight is dropping, she's going to be cold. That's the body response when we lose weight quickly and when we're not getting the right kind of support for ourselves because we're not looking after our basic needs. So it's completely normal that she feels that way physically. You're absolutely right. That means she needs better sleep, she needs better nutrition, she needs to start taking care of her own needs. However, when somebody is going through a grief process, in those early stages, it can feel almost impossible to even get out of bed, and yet it's impossible to sleep when you're in bed. It can feel monumentally impossible to put food in your mouth because you feel only dread in your belly. And everything that you do is drenched in a sense of death. It's just tinnitus. I say that all the time. Tinnitus is the ringing in your ears, and it's the same emotional ringing in the ears with death. all that will be going through her mind in this moment in time is that she's lost her stepdad, and her stepdad's her dad. So basically she's lost one of her primary caregivers, and it's a big, big emotional shift. It's a void. So a few weeks into this is not abnormal at all. Also, when we have high stress levels and anxiety, often we hunch over and we can mutter to ourselves. We're aware of we're doing it. We're aware that it doesn't sound good. We're aware it might look strange to other people, but we don't really care because we're trying to give messages both to the people around us that we're struggling and messages to the self to reinforce the fact that we're going through this struggle. So again, that is very typical behaviour. And the memory and not remembering what happened that day, it's okay. Her mind's blocked it out. She's traumatised by what's happened. And so it's just shut it down. She might never remember what happened that day, and that's perfectly all right. She doesn't need to. Memory and confusion, very common at high stress levels, very common when we're dealing with grief, very distressing for people around them to actually manage, because you're watching somebody that's usually able to cope and typically able to deal with life suddenly fall into the abyss. Some people do that very quickly. Some people take a year and then they fall into the abyss. Some people are lucky and they grade it. They feel the grief, but they take the time with it. They allow themselves the space and time and peace and opportunity, and it kind of is more gradual. But for the most part, grief is like a truck hitting you at 1,000 miles per hour, fully loaded, right? So what can you do? If she doesn't want to see a doctor yet, that's okay. She probably doesn't want to talk to anyone about it because she knows she's going to burst into tears, be inconsolable, and probably will instantly get prescribed antidepressants. And she might not be in a state or a space where she wants that. Because remember, this pain that she's feeling, as I always say, it's love in disguise. This is her connection with him. And it's horrible right now. It's painful, it's debilitating, it's distressing. But it's also her connection with him. It's her thread. And that thread will change and it will ease and she will find her way forward. But right now it's raw and it's agony. And so she's managing that all the time. She's carrying around that rawness and agony. And it feels very isolating. It feels very unique. And even though other people will be struggling, she will feel like it's her struggle alone. Because the thing about grief is you deal with it absolutely individually. So it doesn't matter that other people are grieving, you feel it uniquely. So the best thing that you can do is just reassure her that you're present. Acknowledge that right now she's losing weight and call that out. Say, Mum, I love you and I'm worried. And I know that this is really hard, but we have to make sure that at least you're eating, at least you're able to keep up with your body's requirements, because otherwise you're going to make yourself ill, and that's going to give you additional issues. And you personally, as a daughter or son, it's going to be a problem for you as well. So just think about her basic needs. What are her favourite meals? You know, what are the things that you can provide for her? If she can get some high calorie drinks, maybe anything that just brings her that nutrition that she requires during this really difficult time. But it's such early days right now. Just lots of reassurance, lots of comfort. Just allow her that space right now. I'm going to be here obviously next week and the week after, so if it gets any worse, just come back and let me know, all right? Myself and my wife have a few selective friends that seem that they only want us when they've got nothing better to do. I had one of these 2 weeks ago actually, so somebody else was saying something similar to this. So, got nothing better to do, and where no one else to go, as an example, a so-called friend about 3 weeks ago was at our house and had the sniffles, but then last weekend made an excuse about him and his family being ill, and you're just feeling that people don't really respect and respond to you how you guys respond to them. I guess the thing about friendship is that very often it can be that you give more to people than they reflect giving to you, because we all have different natures. If you're a highly agreeable nature and your friends aren't that agreeable, then you're going to end up giving and doing more for them than they would for you. And I guess it comes down to the fact that you have to look at the checks and balances and say to yourself, is it worth investing in this relationship? Is it worth having these friends? Or Do I need to invest my energy elsewhere in finding new friends? Look, my understanding of great friends is that when you find them, you never want to let them go. And it sounds like you are the kind of people who invest in friendships and you show up. Now, the thing about showing up is it's very helpful for the people who you show up for. It's deeply, deeply helpful because they get what they need. But because you're agreeable and they don't show up for you, you kind of are like, okay, well, I'm an agreeable person, so I'll just keep on getting used. So they get to win on both levels. They don't have to make any effort with you, but then you will always show up for them. So the bigger question is, okay, what is it about you and your other half that means that you put up with that? You don't need to put up with that. You don't deserve to put up with that. So you either do what I would suggest doing, which you call them out and you just say, listen, at this moment in time, it feels like this relationship or these relationships, the ones that aren't working, don't really meet the standards of what we want, and that's okay. If you don't really want to have friendships with us, that's okay. You know, I will gracefully bow out and find new friends. Or is it that you just don't understand that we have these needs? Because arguably, you need to give them a chance, I would say, to up their game in the friendship zone. And then from there, if they're like, well, actually, you know what, we don't really connect anymore, well, you can kind of have the grief, let it go, move on. If they're like, what? Never knew you felt like that. That's an adjustment process and phase in the relationship. And you can be like, yeah, well, I would like to see you more. And I'd like you to show up more for me. And if they then come through with that, brilliant. But it sounds to me like you're also getting this feeling that there's an undercurrent of them not necessarily being willing to invest what you would require for a good, mutually deserved friendship. And so if that's the case, you and your partner need to think about meeting other couples, think about interest groups, passion projects, joining community groups, doing things that bring you into the mix with people who are going to genuinely reflect the worthiness that you put into relationships. Because you know what? It's hard to find good friends. It really is. We all know, everyone listening tonight knows how difficult it is to find really good friends. And when you get them, it's like such a blessing. It's such a gift. It's what I've said to my boys as they were growing up, you know, don't lose those childhood friends. You know, you just think that friends are going to come on the conveyor belt of friendship until you die. And then you get to like 25 and you're like, where are all my friends? Why have my friends disappeared? And you're like, I didn't invest in any of them because I always thought the friend train was going to be there. And it's really difficult as an adult to meet friends. Adults have loads of commitments and very little time, and they've already got mates, and you're like, oh, and then some of them were clever enough to keep their childhood friends. We all know what I'm talking about. So like finding good friends is, yeah, an art form to a degree, but getting the ones that reflect a dynamic of worth that is equal to you is paramount to feel fulfilled, really paramount. Emma, can I ask how long EMDR takes to work? Does it take time after sessions finish and is it an ongoing process? Well, EMDR is through tapping and eye movements, and essentially you shouldn't end the EMDR until you feel that you're de-traumatized whatever the initial trauma was, or the trauma that you're looking at was, or each trauma independently of the other. Arguably, you should be at a point when you finish therapy where you feel alleviated of it. If it's been effective, I would say that very often in 6 sessions, a lot of people will have experienced EMDR and will feel massively alleviated from that trauma. For others, it might take longer, but for the most part, it's known to be quite a quick therapy. Having said that, some people will return for sessions of EMDR over periods of time. So it might be that they practice it themselves, they get to a point where they've de-traumatized with the actual therapist, and then they leave, and months later they might need to come back and just have a bit of a check-in. But like I said, it tends to be really effective. It doesn't work for everyone either. So don't feel like if you go to EMDR and it isn't effective, there's something broken or wrong with you. It's not true at all. There are things like schema therapy that's really effective. There's just integrative approaches. So never feel if a therapy doesn't work that it's you that's the problem. It's usually just the relationship and the therapeutic paradigm that you're working within that just isn't working for you. But like I said, if you've not started it yet and you're going to start it, it tends to be really effective with a lot of people. So do not stress. Right, guys, I will see you next week. Same time, same place, same space. If you're around for my crime on... No, it sounds wrong, doesn't it? If you're around for my crime, I need some accessories. I need some people to help me on Wednesday. The bank, I'm not robbing a bank on Wednesday, but I'll be covering another case on Wednesday. So if you want to join me for a live chat, do that on YouTube, and I'll see you there. Take care, guys.